Hi there, my name is Tim from the Press X to Science panel here at PAX Australia 2021. Before we begin, a couple of very important words that we need to say before we begin our panel today. Ngalak karach wajak nunga mort, balap mulyak nija bujak ngalak nyin. Here in Perth, we stand on the traditional land of the Wajak Noongar people, whose custodianship of this country goes back over 60,000 years. We acknowledge that we are streaming today from stolen land, that sovereignty was never ceded, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. We hope you enjoy. Hi everyone, welcome to PAX Australia 2021. Unfortunately presented online for the second year in a row, but hopefully not for a third year, fingers crossed. We're really excited to be coming to you again this year. We are, as far as we are aware, the longest running panel at PAX Australia, with the exception obviously of the main stage panels. So 8 years running, which is really exciting. If anyone can give us extra data points that suggest that that's not true, we were happy to take that on board. That's what science is about. It's about changing your views when you get new data points. But we are here again to explore the nexus between science and gaming and see how improving one improves the other and vice versa, and how it's just a really incredible place to live.
And we just wanted to point out that because of where we live, we are all vaccinated.
It's not a boast, but
yeah. But also, we're in a city with pretty much no community spread, so we are able to gather in the same
this is kosher.
physical location, which is actually, we haven't done this for a long time.
Yeah.
No, it's been a very long time.
Yes.
But also, we're very appreciative of that fact. We don't take it for granted, and we hope that wherever you are also able to be safe and happy with friends and family.
Or at least well on the way to it. But yeah, so today we want to explore a whole bunch of stuff. We're exploring advances in artificial intelligence, how they can make your games and your bread that much better, how playing a game can keep you healthy by analysing your poop, and how the last generation of video games has already created the next generation of scientists, engineers, and other STEM professionals.
Hi, I'm Megan.
Hi, I'm Phil.
I'm Tim, and welcome to Press X to Science.
Once again.
All right, let's get into it. As we said, it's been 7 years now, panels looking back at gaming and science. And in our very first panel, way back in 2014, we talked about one of the most important science fiction games in gaming history. And to have come full circle in 2021, we are now currently enjoying the remastered version of the Mass Effect trilogy. Well, Phil is. He did promise me when the remastered version came out, he would take a serious effort to tackle the games, and true to his word, he has smashed out most of the first one and is enjoying it, or so he tells me, every bit as much as I hoped he would have. So I'm very excited for that. Also, it's really nice just to vicariously watch someone enjoy a game that has been so instrumental and important to you, and seeing them have that same incredible experience. So I'm really excited for that, and so Phil is too. But what is it that makes beloved franchises like this so accessible and beloved? Why is it that the Mass Effect games, with very little change, have still become so important today as they were all that time ago? And one of the answers is that it's personal stories, but it's also set in a really believable universe. And I think this is a really key part to the success of some of these science fiction games. Science fiction really lives or dies by the audience's ability to employ suspension of disbelief. So your ability to say, I accept that this fantastical or impossible thing is happening, and with that accepting, I can move on and enjoy the rest of the show or movie or game or whatever, book, whatever it happens to be, and not worry about, my brain constantly harping on it, being like, oh, well, that's just not, people can't float around like that. And so suspension of disbelief is a really, really interesting thing to research, but to employ and to actually write it is very, very difficult. So lots and lots of studies have been done into how suspension of disbelief works. And what you kind of need is you need to have as fewer deviations from your expected, the way that things work. So in science fiction, obviously you have spaceships, and once you accept that you have spaceships, so long as everything that happens on board that spaceship looks and feels normal and behaves the laws of physics that you would expect, then your brain doesn't have to do too much extra work. Now, you can look at shows like The Expanse, which is one of my personally favorite shows. And The Expanse is a fascinating example because it is ultra realistic. And because it's so realistic, your brain actually starts to sort of go, oh yeah, no, this makes perfect sense. These are some of the difficulties I would have expected to see in space travel. Now, obviously it's not fully realistic. The suspension of disbelief requires us to accept that people are going to other planets and elsewhere in the solar system at incredible speeds that just simply are not humanly possible at the moment. So that's where the suspension of disbelief comes in. And I think that science fiction is actually a little bit easier than fantasy sometimes for suspension of disbelief. One of the good examples that we often give to people in this context is if you imagine what do you expect from a spaceship versus what do you expect from a dragon. So a spaceship, in most people's minds, have very, very few caveats. There's very few suspensions of disbelief that are required for you to accept them. They're a ship, they go into space, they can travel to other planets usually. It's very little point of having a spaceship if it can't travel to another planet or travel somewhere interesting and important. But outside of that, it's mostly normal. Some of them might have gravity on board, some of them might not. And these are some of the questions that you might need to answer in your narrative. But then when you come into dragons, well, what is a dragon? There are so many different interpretations of dragons. Can it fly? Can it not fly? Can it talk? Can it speak psychically? Can it polymorph into a human? Does the color of its scales direct which type of breath it has? Does it have a breath weapon in the parlance of Dungeons and Dragons? There are so many extra layers that need to either be explained or just accepted on behalf of the viewer or the audience in order for you to just accept that dragons are a thing. So science fiction sometimes is a little bit easier to get into for some people than straight up fantasy. Not saying that it's impossible, and in many ways I actually think that this shows the hallmarks of why fantasy and good fantasy writers are so talented, because they manage to put so much world building into their stories without you having to challenge your suspension of disbelief. But I think that science fiction quite often, and games like Mass Effect, allow you to get into them a little bit easier. And what is it that Mass Effect is doing that is making it so easy? Why do some of these games, I say some of these games because obviously there's a lot of controversy around the Mass Effect Andromeda, which I am adamant that I will go back to and replay at some point, because I did bounce off it so hard. I really want to love it. I really, really do. But I just struggled. But what is it that makes Mass Effect so engaging and so dynamic? So Mass Effect, on its surface, is essentially, it's a soap opera. Really. It's personal stories in a universe that is big and epic and fantastical in so many ways, especially when you sort of get into the story of the Reapers. But the Mass Effect codex and the peripheral stories that are being told around the character of Shepard are deeply, deeply entrenched in scientific understanding. And it's the understanding of how we live in and explore outer space. The really interesting things that are in the codex are so fascinating to me. There's so much story about how redshift works, or the Doppler effect in the context of light. How the spaceships move, how the inertial dampeners work, the whole physics behind this element 0, which is one of the biggest suspension of disbelief that you have to employ in the game, that's actually really, really deeply explored, but it's only explored insofar as you want to. Players can actually dip in and out of this at their leisure because the codex is an encyclopedia that you have to go into and look at yourself. And sometimes these parallel stories and these side characters are having conversations about things, but again, you have to kind of seek them out. You have to listen for them if you want to. And so that ability to do as much or as little science really gives you the ability to ground yourself in the world as much or as little as you want. So you actually kind of get to direct your own suspension of disbelief by how deep you want to go into the game. One of the things that really fascinates me actually is the radiative heat dissipation, which is one of the codex entries in, I think it's Mass Effect 1, I think it's 1, it could be 2 though. And that is essentially that there are molten salts that are ejected from the outside of the ship, carrying all the excess heat that then fly past the ship and are collected in collectors at the back, and it's sort of that radiative process as it passes through the vacuum of space that allows it to dump excess heat. Because the truth of it is that radiation and radiative heat dissipation is one of the biggest engineering challenges on the International Space Station that we have here above our own planet in real life. So, Mass Effect can be played entirely as a sci-fi soap opera, or practically as an undergraduate physics curriculum, and it's a dynamic blend of both at any given moment that you are in control of, that you have power of. And I think that's one of the reasons why Mass Effect, just as it was back in 2014 when we first spoke about it, and now in 2021 with the Remastered edition, I think is such an incredibly engaging and powerful science fiction game.
You are a ranger, exhausted but excited after having stalked your ultimate challenge, a gigantic black bear, for days. You loose an arrow and it flies true, entering the bear's eye socket and killing it immediately. After collecting your trophy from the beast, you pack up to return home when a rustle in the bushes startles you into firing another razor-sharp payload in the direction of the noise. One heartbeat, then another, and a figure tumbles out of the bushes, and you gasp in surprise. Who is it? What happens next? Well, we'll come back to that. But first, let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence in games. Artificial intelligence has always been something of a mixed bag. For every convincing simulacrum of a worthy opponent, such as the opposing tribes in Humankind, or the terrifying alien hunter in Alien Isolation, there are hundreds of examples of bots getting stuck on walls, jumping off cliffs to their doom, or doing an okay job, but just not quite feeling right. Depending on the genre of the game, there are obviously ways around this. The most obvious being to abandon the artificial in artificial intelligence and pit players against other players. This works up to a point. Other players are generally much more fun and interesting challenge to go up against in games that are designed to be competitive. You know, think about your Counter-Strike Go, old school StarCraft or League of Legends. Although on second thoughts, maybe League bots are a little bit more enjoyable to play against than real players. But what if you want a player to experience a complex narrative that just isn't compatible with a competitive multiplayer game? There are games that certainly accomplish this. As previously mentioned, Alien Isolation uses an incredible layered artificial intelligence to govern the actions of the terrifying xenomorph that's stalking the player. The developers, Creative Assembly, refer to this system as psychopathic serendipity, which is a fantastic name for an AI design. The design was made up of a macro, high-level director AI, and a micro-level, individual-level alien AI. And the way it works is that the director AI observes the player and knows their movements and objectives, but it can only selectively feed that information through to the micro alien AI. If you want to get an idea of the nitty-gritty of exactly how the alien works, there's a brilliant Tommy Thompson video on his AI and Games YouTube channel, which goes through it, and I would highly recommend you do, because he's a very knowledgeable dude about AI and games, and he really just goes through it step by step, and you can see how much work those guys put into that AI. But anyone that has played that game, Alien Isolation, will know that this design was a total success. The player felt powerless, terrified, hunted, but never cheated. But the problem is that success is also a result of two very complex interacting systems that were honed over the entirety of a game development cycle to produce just one single entity in a game where the environment was tightly controlled and relatively linear. Not fully linear, there were different ways that you could go about things, but relatively linear in the grand scheme of things. So how can developers generalize reactive behavior to offer branching narrative paths and replayability without having to completely devote all their time to do it? So enter machine learning. Machine learning as a whole encompasses a bunch of different ways of teaching an artificial intelligence how to act or react to input data. You've probably heard of Google's DeepMind AI that has been taught to race through single-player games and absolutely obliterate human players at everything from StarCraft to the old-school board game Go. But deep learning algorithms can also be turned towards producing storylines for players to explore, which is precisely what a company named Latitude did with a game called AI Dungeon. AI Dungeon is a game where you are given prompts and asked to describe what you do. It's a bit like Dungeons and Dragons in that, but instead of a human dungeon master reacting to your actions, it's an AI that uses a language model called GPT-3, which stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer 3. It's just a name, but that guides you through its generated world. As you may have guessed, the story I told at the start of this segment was an adventure I had in the world of AI Dungeon. Who was the figure falling out of the bushes? Why, it was my brother, of course. What followed was a tearful scene involving apologies and oaths to help his family out once he was gone. It was quite effective, and even more impressive due to knowing that it was all generated on the fly. This was not a pre-made story at all. The ability for games to take advantage of this technology, immediately conjures up thoughts of a future where the burden of producing an effective narrative, often the part of a game that developers struggle with the most, could be enhanced or even completely outsourced to an artificial intelligence that builds one from one of these large language models. Of course, that conjuration is immediately smashed because unfortunately there are serious shortcomings associated with these models, which is lucky for us humans. We are going to still be useful. Because, well, we're useful and we're not useful because the data that's used in these models is produced from humans, right? Unfortunately, they contain all of the shortcomings and biases that humans are capable of possessing. AI Dungeon itself came under heavy scrutiny after it was discovered that players were entering prompts that would result in the AI producing traumatic scenarios and sometimes involving minors, and that these scenarios would then become part of the data that would be fed to other players. So people that weren't going for these scenarios were seeing them. The fact that people would go for them in the first place was a little bit wonky as well, or very wonky. So yeah, it should always be remembered that the data that underlies these new artificial intelligences are not automatically objective. So they contain all of the biases that the base data contained, and so developers must be extremely careful lest they subject players to generated stories that end up being racist, misogynist, or otherwise upsetting. The ethical considerations underlying the next step in artificial intelligence for games, and especially narrative games, are not to be taken lightly. Diversity of data and diversity of experience in developing algorithms is a huge weak point that the industry as a whole has in terms of making sure that these technologies are open and acceptable for use by all people of all backgrounds. In the meantime, there are less fraught ways of generating unpredictable and exciting storylines. The recently released Wildermyth uses a library of plays system, whereby there are hundreds of potential plays that have conditions that need to be met before they can be used as the next step in the story. And we found, we've played it, Tim and I have played it, and it really does. It keeps the story really fresh and unpredictable, while still maintaining control on topics that might be harmful. But I mean, even then, we have seen some issues with some of the storylines not allowing people to fully inhabit their characters, such as bi, trans characters. But that is part of the development of the game and of this technology. So while deep learning in general may not be the be all and end all for narrative generation, it does pose some exciting questions. Questions you might ask the humans in your life when you have them around for a cooperative board game night or a competitive deathmatch online. I'll be back with a couple more stories later on.
So Tim, you are famously a dungeon master. Do you feel threatened
that my job's going to be taken?
Yeah.
Look, on the one hand, no, I don't. And on the other hand, I'm like, oh, that'd be nice. Maybe I'll get to play. But no, I actually use a lot of AI tools in dungeon mastering, dungeoneering. So little plot hooks. Sometimes I use some online generators that generate that also NPCs when you need someone on the fly when players are being particularly challenging and you need someone to sort of throw into the mix. It can generate really, really interesting and internally consistent NPCs, and I think that's what's interesting is the internal consistency, because you can make any roll table to get a random number of things in there.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always feel like, oh, they're a baker, but also a Satanist medic. Where did these things come from?
Yeah. I mean, do you think that it's ever going to get to the point where you will be able to just sit there and
play a game with an AI dungeon master?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Do we want it to? That's the other question.
I don't think it's ever going to be as good as a person.
No, I don't think so either.
It can't problem solve creatively on the fly. It's like you said, it's limited by the data set it's trained on.
Yeah.
So it's never going to be able to do everything perfectly.
Yeah.
And then the other trade-off is, as I've learned through listening to a lot of seminars by my supervisors, other PhD students who all do AI research, is there's this huge trade-off between, do you want it fast or do you want it good?
Pick one.
So I've done a lot of work in AI for research groups at the last university that I worked at, and it is insane how much work goes into making an AI actually work. And if your training model is very small, and let's face it, a lot of these games that are doing this kind of stuff, their training models aren't very big, which is why you do get some wacky stuff come out of it. But if your training model's small, it doesn't work. If you don't let it run for long enough, it doesn't work. If you go too far outside of its parameters, it falls apart. And depending on what kind of AI you're using, if it's a black box AI, you don't even know why it's broken. So
it's never going to be as robust as someone who's a person and a good creative problem solver.
Exactly.
And it's certainly not as fun if we didn't have Tim at the table. It'd be awful.
But I am really excited to see where it goes, because I think that this kind of AI generated content is really going to be what makes the next big MMO.
Oh yeah.
Because that kind of NPC interaction is usually what's lacking, that inability to react to environment, to what other players and what other characters around you are doing. So I think that could really, really change things.
And I think just as you say, as just a tool to prompt you as well, that can just be really, really useful when you just need a little prompt to get the juices going, and then away you go with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sweet.
Have you ever been confused or perhaps broken out into a sweat when trying to prove you are a human to your computer? I know I have. So we currently use CAPTCHA tests, which is an acronym, which stands for Completely Automated Public Turing Test to Tell Computers and Humans Apart. So it's kind of an acronym. There's a lot of T's on that last T there. CAPTCHA tests were interesting because they started off being the sort of jumbled up words, and you had to decode what those words were. Now, the way the tests are designed is that they're designed to be really easy for humans to do, but difficult for computers or AI to do. People are really good at processing visual information and seeing patterns in pictures or visual things, whereas computers and AI find this really, really difficult. So initially, these jumbled up text pictures were enough, However, AI has now gotten better and better and can now solve these with about a 99% accuracy rate. So we moved to image select capture tests. This is where it shows you a grid of images and you have to select all the pictures with a car in it or something like that. Now, these ones worked for a while until AI has sort of caught up, and now AI can solve these ones with an accuracy rate of about 70% with an average solve time of 20 seconds. So it's no longer as secure as it once was at telling apart humans and computers. At the same time, both of these capture techniques were inaccessible to blind people. So there is actually also audio captures where words are said, but there is background noise to stop voice recognition software from being able to tell what the words are. The current iteration of captures are the tick box captures, which says, I am not a robot, and you check the box. Now, in researching for this story, I actually found out that very, very few people know how these actually work, the nitty-gritty details of how decisions are made about whether you're a human or an AI, and this is on purpose. In order to stop the design of an AI that can crack these captures reliably, only the people who design them really know how they work. Some researchers have experimented with them, and we know that some of the factors that probably go into the decision making to tell if you're human or not, like how long it takes you to click on the box, where you click in the little capture box. Are you clicking just once or twice near the checkbox, or is it sort of like what an AI might do is a systematic many clicks across the whole box? It also looks at things like your cookies, your user history, and information about your browser to determine whether you are a human. This type of capture is simple, accessible, and not terribly annoying. However, AI is still catching up. At the moment, it's sitting at about a 40% pass rate, so still less than chance or a coin toss. But what happens when it catches up? As I was researching captures, I found two really interesting ones that could point towards some future techniques we could use to tell humans and AI apart. They were made by a web developer called Miguel Orteza for his web portfolio. They're not proper secure capture techniques, but they're still interesting nonetheless. The first one was a capture where you had to use your webcam and do squats, actual physical, exercise in front of your webcam before completing a purchase on Amazon. I can see this being useful for perhaps stopping some drunk late night, online shopping, if you were so inclined. And the second one that they designed was a little mini Doom game where you needed to shoot 4 enemies to prove you're a human and not an AI. Then I fell down another internet rabbit hole where I found a Reddit community called What Does It Run Doom? Or Doom Running, which basically is this community of people who challenge themselves to see if they can get really strange pieces of hardware to run the classic game Doom. So, which of the following do you think you could play Doom on? An ATM, an Apple Watch, a pregnancy test, a Nintendo DS, a spectrum analyzer, a DSLR camera, a graphics calculator, a very old school iPod, a Mikey validator, which is the public transport swipe card thing in Melbourne or Victoria, or all of the above. If you've ever done multiple choice tests, you would know that all of the above is usually the correct answer, and if you selected all of the above, you would be correct. All of these pieces of hardware have been made to run Doom successfully. Here's some footage of some of them running Doom. I must say the ATM one, the person did own the ATM. It wasn't a publicly available ATM with actual money in it. But that would be kind of cool if you could play Doom and win money. And I think my favorite was the pregnancy test. The fact that they actually got it to run on something with such a small amount of hardware to work with was really, really interesting. Now, doom running is purely an exercise in creativity and having a bit of fun with technology, but it's still a very interesting subreddit to check out if you want to see more. And maybe one day games could be used to prove you are a human and not an AI bot.
So, had either of you two heard of doom running before?
Not by that name. I have seen news articles with it, like the pregnancy test one, for example. I saw relatively recently.
Yeah, you got my multiple choice answer correct.
Yeah, I think the Mikey Key one, that was pretty impressive. That was extremely cool.
But it's also interesting to think that like the kinds of code optimizations that you need to get Doom running on these kinds of hardware probably feed back into the game development world pretty well, because if you can optimize your code that much, you can make better code run on actual computers and consoles and other portable devices. So I'd like to think that they're all feeding into each other.
Well, I just liked how creative they had to be in order to work with those really constraints of whatever item they were trying to get it to run on.
Yeah, whether it be memory or like just the actual physical size of the screen. It like reminds me of the demo scene.
I miss demo scenes so much.
Like all the challenges they used to have with fitting a full musical soundtrack and all these visuals in like 64 kilobytes of RAM. They still do them.
And they made the best music too.
Yeah,
like, it was really epic music.
Absolute bangers. All banger, no clanger.
What about the capture tests? How do you feel about capture tests?
I mean, if it prevents people from stealing your identities or logging in as you, then that's always good. Like, most people use two-factor authentication on their accounts, but
it was more for preventing DDoS attacks on websites and whatnot.
Sure.
Which is really, really important. But also, I think that it's always going to be that carousel, right? Like, it's always going to be the hacker and the researcher chasing each other. Like you said, the developers didn't release the code, so researchers try to break the code to see how it works, and then the hackers use that to create the thing that bypasses it, so they have to develop a new one. It's going to be like that until we run out of computers, or the AI takes over forever.
Which we're totally in favour of. Please don't kill us. AI overlords of the future. All right, shall we move on to next?
Let's go.
Let's do it.
Now, one of the other most important scientific scenes, I think, in video gaming history was undoubtedly the grand finale of GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64. Came out in 1997, if you're old enough to remember hiring it from Blockbuster. If any of those words make sense to you, congratulations, you probably have as much grey in your beard as I do. But it was an incredibly seminal game, and just like the movie, it gives players the opportunity to replicate the actions that were happening in the movie. And the game finishes on a level called Cradle, which is set in the receiver assembly suspended above the unbelievably big, and looking back on it now, unbelievably foggy Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico. So Arecibo is a massive radio telescope facility it's built into a valley. So it's not a movable thing that you can turn around and look at different parts of the sky. It's literally built into a valley itself, and it made it the largest telescope in the world by a huge margin. It was originally built in 1963, and from side to side, it is 300 meters across. For any of our imperial friends who might be viewing from overseas, that's 1,000 feet, give or take. So 300 meters or 1,000 feet in diameter is massive, and it needs that collecting space to be able to see some of the faintest and furthest objects in the galaxy. But back then in 1963, it was not originally used for that. It was originally commissioned to characterize the upper atmosphere of our own planet, helping us to hopefully see incoming nuclear warheads at the height of the Cold War. So, a bit of an eek right there, but after that, it was used for looking at pulsars, which is what I did my thesis on, which is something I'm deeply passionate about. Pulsars are the dense cores of supermassive stars that have exploded. What's left is a neutron star. I could go on about this for so long, but essentially they flash really brightly, and they spin as they spin, making them flash, and they flash up to 1,000 times a second, sometimes more in the case of millisecond pulsars. If you want to learn more about pulsars, I implore you to get in touch. I will talk about them forever. They are just super exciting. But the research on pulsars is actually what gave rise to the at-home project. So you might remember SETI at home or Einstein at home, which in turn gave rise to Eve's Project Discovery, which we again have covered in our previous panels here at PAX Australia. But I think the most exciting thing about the Arecibo radio telescope is not GoldenEye, but the Arecibo message. So the Arecibo message really quickly was essentially a 3-minute pulse of intense radio energy that we directed towards the Globular Cluster M13 in 1974. So a globular cluster is a giant collection of stars all smushed in together, kind of like a mini galaxy, but not really, but that's kind of the best way I can describe it at the moment. It's lots of stars all tightly bound together. And M13 is about 25,000 light years from Earth. So that's both quite far away, but also not really that far away given the size of the visible universe, which is billions of light years. So 25,000 light years is a very long way away, and this radio pulse has not reached it. 1974 means that it's 47 light years ago, because the radio energy travels at the speed of light, so it takes 47 years to travel 47 light years. And so it's nowhere near, but it has passed through dozens and dozens of planets. In fact, we've counted several exoplanets that the pulse would have passed by. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What is the pulse? Why is it important? It was originally conceived by Frank Drake, who is made famous for the Drake equation, something else that we have covered in previous PAX panel discussions. The Drake equation is one of the equations that we use to determine whether or not we should realistically be able to see aliens somewhere out there in the big wide galaxy of our Milky Way. It was also championed by Carl Sagan, and Carl Sagan helped a lot with the designing of the message that would go into the Arecibo message. If you don't know Carl Sagan, he was a champion of science communications and an incredible human being, certainly one of my personal heroes. And the Frank Drake designed designed the Arecibo message to be a puzzle. It's a tiny little game for you to unpack if you are an alien somewhere out there between here and M13, 25,000 light years away. So, how is it a game? Well, how do you communicate to someone who doesn't speak? Heck, you don't even know if they speak in words. They could communicate in completely foreign ways that we haven't even conceived of. So how do you send information to something that is so alien? What he essentially came up with was a pulse of energy that was made up of ones and zeros, so binary, the most basic form of communication that we know, that we can devise with our weird spongy brains, and made up of 23 columns and 73 rows, both prime numbers, so very important numbers mathematically, and if you are an intelligent species, you should probably know what a prime number is by now. The first part of the message was just the numbers 1 to 10, saying, hey, this is how we count. Then it includes the elements that make up DNA and also the nucleotides that form the double helix, and then the double helix structure itself, so a bit of a calling card of what we are, what we're made of. It has a very rudimentary stick figure, the kind that you would see in a lot of early video games. It has representations of the planets of the solar system and, of course, our sun itself. And finally, the radio dish itself, the Arecibo dish, including its shape and its geometry and its diameter, which are important if you want to send a reply back. But also, if you would tell you so much about how we generated the message itself and the technological level that we were at. So, decoding puzzles like the Arecibo message is possibly some of the oldest games that humans have been playing since the dawn of time. Riddles are a fundamental form of human communication that cross languages, cultures, continents, and time. We've been doing it for as long as we have been able to communicate. And schools and universities have taught communication theory using the concepts in the Arecibo message. And in fact, in 2019, there was a competition for a new and improved message that was open to schools, universities, and really anyone for people to say, hey, this is how we might communicate to an alien species. And that information was also used to try and find out what are the fundamentals in human communication. So again, using it as an important scientific tool to better understand ourselves. So while we know that the Arecibo message hasn't reached its destination, and it's probably not passed across any intelligent species, and even if it has, it's very unlikely they would be able to decode it, because as beautiful as it was also such low resolution and condensed into that 3-minute pulse that it's very hard to decode. But it was a better way for us to understand ourselves, and that's really, really important. Now, unfortunately, and this is the sad part that you all knew was coming, the Arecibo Observatory was destroyed late last year. So in fact, shortly after the last PAX, in December 2020, the Arecibo Observatory came to a horrifying end. It was damaged by hurricanes in 2017, which saw one of the important feed array lines cut. And it was at that point that we kind of knew that it was on its last legs and it probably wasn't going to survive. And it was very, very costly to keep it maintained. But by 2020, in December, the rest of the support lines snapped and the receiver dish fell into the main reflector dish, pretty much destroying the telescope and certainly destroying any attempts that could be made to salvage it. So it was deeply, deeply sad. But, and this is the weird thing, that destruction was weirdly and bizarrely accurately predicted in the rogue transmission map for Battlefield 4 in 2013. So the Battlefield 4 had a concept called levolution, which was a way for levels to evolve. I know, we all hate it. But the way that the telescope collapses in Battlefield 4 was almost identical to how it actually collapsed in real life. You could actually be forgiven for thinking that it was modeled on the collapse rather than the other way around. So I feel like that's a beautiful way that games have bookended Arecibo, its glory days and also its final days. And with that we say, Veil, Arecibo, we barely knew you.
Just a little tear.
I can't take you seriously when you do that.
Just a little tear. Antenna.
It's a really sad end of an era with Arecibo going, but we do look back on it fondly and we thank it for all its wonderful gaming memories that it's given us over the years and the incredible scientific discoveries and advances in how we do citizen science.
Yeah, absolutely. GoldenEye, an absolute, legendary N64 game. I don't know how many hours I put that into.
I mean, it practically defined the first-person shooter. Certainly the first-person multiplayer shooter.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, I only knew the telescope from the game first, then found out it was actually a real-world telescope.
Which I think is true for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And soundtrack.
Oh, so good. Such
Absolutely
good.
perfect.
Decent level for multiplayer. Cradle, not bad, but it's no facility.
It's no facility.
It's no facility. Proxy mines only slaps. But and the thing is, it has that connection though. Like people saw that telescope and were like, oh, that's so, and maybe they connected with it a little bit more than they would if they hadn't seen it in something that they like. Popular culture that they'd actually played as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also seeing it in Battlefield 4
Yeah.
all these years later is
pretty wild.
Is awesome.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really interesting to see how games have also evolved in that respect as well.
Yeah, a little bit of a difference, like a lot of fog. There was a lot of fog back then.
Can't see more than 2 meters.
I think they call it the fog of time.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And crazy to see how accurate the destruction was in Battlefield 4 versus what actually happened to the
Arecibo antenna, which is again really hard to watch, but it is
tragic. Yeah. It is tragic.
Anyway, let's move on.
Yes, away.
Do you ever play on your phone while sitting on the toilet? Yeah, me too. In fact, in Japan, late last year, in 2020, there was a game released that encourages this behavior. The game is called Unkore, coming from 2 Japanese words. Unko meaning poop, and kore meaning collection. And if you hadn't already guessed, it's actually a gacha game where you collect anime characters which are loosely based on bacteria found in your gut and your poo. Why would anyone make this game? Well, the game was made by volunteers from the Japan Unko Society who study poo for science. And what they get you to do, instead of flushing real-world money down the drain in order to collect these characters, you can trade your data about, or information about your poo. So reporting the color, consistency, and appearance of your poo through the game in order to earn in-game currency to unlock more characters. And this data is what the scientists are interested in studying. because often there's this taboo around talking about gross things, and obviously not as much money is put into research for it because it's seen as gross, and so they kind of get overlooked. However, changes in the appearance, consistency, and color of poo can actually be symptoms of quite serious health conditions, so they're important to pay attention to. For example, changes in poo are symptoms of health conditions such as colorectal cancer, hemorrhoids, and even irritable bowel syndrome, which is something that I actually discovered I have earlier this year on top of a already fantastic year that we're having. So, yeah. Unfortunately, the game is only available in Japan and in Japanese at the moment, as it's made by volunteers. So if you read Japanese, it's probably worth checking out. In researching this story, I had to Google Translate their website, which led to some interesting Google translations, including the aim of the Japanese Unko Society, which is to create a society where I'm going to teach a poop can be said to be natural. In other words, reducing that taboo around talking about feces. Other great lines that came up were when talking about IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, that people want to be released from the fear of domination by shit. Yeah. And of course, the true identity of shit, or what poo is actually composed of, which is mostly undigested food. So if you're interested in seeing more pictures of anime characters based on bacteria found in your gut, check out their official Twitter account.
Would you play it?
Science? Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think games like this, this particular game, like that's probably the most novel way I've seen to get data like this, taboo data, like in the hands of the scientists that need them.
Yeah, so you're actually just self-reporting on color, consistency, and appearance of your species. So basically the Bristol stool chart, which if you haven't seen before, you should look up.
Yeah,
it's very scientific. It's good enough for Gwyneth Paltrow. It's good enough for you.
Oh no.
No, but it is actually a scientific chart of normal and then not normal and not normal in another way.
Yeah.
The two ends of not normal.
Like watery and very solid.
Very not.
We've all been there. Actually, that's the thing, is we're having a bit of a giggle because it is a bit taboo. It is a little bit weird to talk about. But hopefully, the Unkore can show us how to be more normal about our fear of poop.
But I think more than everyday conversation, it was more like you would report that symptom to your healthcare provider or be more willing to report that symptom and go, actually, that's not normal, instead of just completely ignoring it and not even noticing, because it can be like an important sign of pretty not good stuff happening. Sorry, words.
Yeah, no, but often the first sign of things like, as you said, like colorectal cancer is seeing a change in your stool.
Yeah.
So this is really, it is a little bit wacky, but it's an important subject. And the microbiome in your stomach we're becoming more and more aware of all the importance that actually has in heaps of different diseases and heaps of different
and
health issues.
So poorly understood as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's if we get more people playing it, does any of the money from the payments go to the research?
No, you don't pay money to play.
Oh,
you
it's
just,
fully...
You put your data in.
Oh, so it's literally pay with the poop.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Yep. Free to poop. Poop to play? Poop to play.
Poop to play.
Finally, 2021 marks the 10th anniversary of what is easily the single most influential game in, personally, my career as a scientist, and that is, of course, Kerbal Space Program. To celebrate, Squad have released a 20-minute-long documentary exploring the profound impact that the game has had on people around the world, including many young scientists who credit their careers to their time spent playing Kerbal Space Program. The video's name, The Kerbal Effect, is a play on a phenomenon called the overview effect. It's a fundamental shift in the psyche that seems to affect every single astronaut who has ever spent time in orbit around our planet. Astronauts consistently report that seeing the planet as a whole, without visible borders or demarcations that dictate who is allowed to live where has given them a newfound sense of oneness and a genuine appreciation for the shared journey that we all find ourselves on as a single species on this little blue orb. The well over 1,000 hours that I have spent in Kerbal Space Program has literally taught me more about orbital dynamics than nearly 12 years at universities around Australia. It's really, really heartwarming to see that it has also inspired thousands of people around the world to follow their dreams in science and engineering too. The long-awaited sequel to Kerbal Space Program is just over the horizon, fingers crossed, and with more than 10 years of advances in rocketry, we can land them now, for example, but also metamaterials and renewable power technologies and more. I just can't wait to see how it'll inspire the next generation. So here's to Kerbal Space Program and to any other game that you yourself might have found really influential and might have actually dictated your career as a scientist or an engineer or any other STEM professional that we are really, really lucky to have in our world today. It is really, really exciting, though, to see how one game in that respect, but also all these other games as well, have influenced and created, in one sense, an entire generation of scientists and engineers and healthcare professionals, people who are they're driven by that passion to go into an industry that is so, so hard to get into and so demanding and exacting of you.
Yeah.
All because they played a game like Kerbal Space Program is really, really heartwarming.
I think it's nice because it's suddenly a place where you can play with those ideas, whereas like I feel at school and university you're not always encouraged to play with the ideas. It's more like, here's this test, perform this action.
Yeah, learn, don't play.
Yeah,
Yeah.
They're separate.
Yeah.
And also, on that point, it also encourages collaboration in a more true sense, because you are working with people and sharing, what you've learned on forums and, I can't get into orbit, or I don't know how to do the calculation for how to do my gravity turn.
Yeah.
And people be really genuine, going, think of it like this and think of it like this. And that kind of collaboration and problem solving with
that
people
community
doesn't really happen at universities in that level. Or
Well,
it certainly didn't.
Yeah, it's not guaranteed to happen. Like it's really hard in that kind of pressured environment where you're all kind of cramming for the next exam or next assignment or whatever to really get that genuine, community going. I was pretty lucky. I actually had that, quite a bit at my university experience, but it certainly doesn't happen for everyone. And games like this really make it like just such a collaborative effort and such a learning effort for everybody to get everyone onto the same page, kind of thing, because then they can truly engage with the rest of the community.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely copy everyone's things off online for oxygen not included, because there's just it's the same with Kerbal. There's so many things to think about. Like, it's really hard for one person to solve all of the problems, but if you all come at it from a different viewpoint and you contribute together, it's a lot easier, obviously, to...
And also you get that iteration where people go, I found this really cool way to solve this problem, and then someone else goes, I hadn't thought of it like that, but also if you change this around and now you can get it like this, especially with oxygen not included, where people find more efficient ways of like cooling down things or routing power in a different way.
Yeah. Now, are you talking about a game or scientific research? It sounds exactly the same. Like, you have that, in the perfect world, you have that collaborative, like, I've made this tiny little step. Oh, great, I'm going to use that to take the next step. So, it all feeds into each other, and it's all aligned with that, that exploration and that scientific journey of hypothesis, testing, moving, let's go, let's keep learning, let's keep the knowledge going.
I'm definitely interested to see what number 2 brings.
Yes.
I'm nervous. I'm excited, but I'm also I need it to be good. I just need it to be very good. But it is a good team. Like, we've seen the caliber of the team behind it. So I don't think I should be nervous. No. I'm just a nervous person.
I thought you were going to say you were nervous for the amount of spare time you're about to not have.
Already in the bin. I've knocked out a calendar year. 2023 is, I assume 2023. The release date obviously keeps changing.
It's
with
probably not going to be next year.
everything that's happening. But I would have to say, do I get long service leave yet?
Thank you so much for joining us here today. Once again, we would love to be out there in the theatre with all you lovely people, but this comes a very close second.
As usual, you can always find us on all the usual online platforms, Twitter, YouTube, website, all very deeply neglected, but do reach out because we're always happy to respond with questions you might have about this panel or anything, really. We just love to chat. We're lovely people.
Speak for yourself. We can't wait to see you all again next year. Hopefully, fingers crossed, in person. But if not, as Tim said, reach out to us, and we'll see you next year with more Press X to Science. Thanks, bye.